Yesterday we ended this study in discussing Joseph. And before we continue discussing Joseph even further, I would like to just do a brief summary of the things that we did cover yesterday. If you look at this top line here, this would be the story of Jacob that we covered yesterday that was in reference to the prophecy that was given regarding Esau and Jacob, the children of Isaac and Rebekah. So we mark this here at this first waymark on this graphical demonstration of the story that we're trying to look at and examine. The reason why we're looking at this is to see that we're looking for the characteristics, how God progressively reveals prophetic light to his people. So at the beginning here, when he reveals to Isaac and Rebekah that they're going to have twins, there's two nations, and it says that I forget how it says it, but it says that the firstborn isn't going to be the greater child. It says that the one who comes out second will be over the firstborn. It says it somehow. I'm not going to refer to that verse here. But that's a challenging thing to come to grips with. So this is another characteristic we see, that when God is revealing prophecy, that it's going to test the faith of the people he's giving it to. And it'll test the faith in such a way that the very promise that he says he's going to bring to pass is something that is hard to believe. It's something that doesn't make sense. In reference to the words I just spoke, that it doesn't make sense, later on when we talk about Moses today, I hope that you'll see more details of why it is that it doesn't make sense. But the reason why this is so challenging is because Esau is the firstborn, and as time went on with this family, Isaac himself, he preferred Esau and wanted to give Esau the birthright, to the point of rebelliousness, because he knew that Jacob was more fitted for receiving the birthrights. Jacob had his focus more on the spiritual emphasis of the birthrights, to be the priest of the household and to carry on that spiritual tradition where they know that the great nation is going to be carried through that line, and also the Savior was going to be born from that line. This is what Jacob wanted. But in this history here, prior to where Jacob has to run away, what we find is, even though Jacob is more spiritually minded, and even though Rebekah knows that Jacob should be receiving the birthrights, and even if you look at Esau and Isaac, you see in all four of these family members that they're exhibiting characteristics of lack of faith in the message that God gave to them. And so the point here is that God said it would happen, but we don't know how or when it's going to happen. And then we find that in response to the prophecy that God says will happen, there's good responses. There's some, to a degree, a certain extent of faith in what he's promising. But then there's also a manifestation of a lack of faith. And that leads to things like Esau just not caring about the birthright altogether, except for the temporal blessings of it. Isaac wanting to bless Esau even though he doesn't have the right mindset for it. Rebekah, it was her idea to carry out the plan to usurp the birthright. And Jacob himself didn't trust that it was going to happen, because even though he wanted it, he was interested in it, he thought that it couldn't happen as long as Esau was around. So they usurped the birthright. This was a manifestation of a lack of faith, and it led to some problematic results for their family situation. And we get to the point now where you start to see, as I said yesterday, there's not so much time, like a revelation of time in this history, but you do see something there in regards to time, because Rebekah tells Jacob to leave just for a few days. Maybe Esau's anger will get calm and you'll be able to come back, everything will be good. In reality, it didn't end up being a few days. Rebekah never saw Jacob again. But when she said that it's a few days, it actually is a few days, because when he arrives at Laban's premises and he wants to work so that he can support Rachel because he wants to marry Rachel, that 7 years that he agreed to carry out in order to have Rachel as a wife, he says that it's a few days. So here you have a prophetic representation, because Rebekah says it's a few days, and Jacob calls it a few days, and a few days is actually 7 years. But keep in mind that Jacob, Rebekah, these characters are representing God's people, such as us. Even though there's some time being revealed here, there's still a lack of understanding exactly of how the message that was brought about here is going to be fulfilled, when it's going to be fulfilled, and how. So he works 7 years for Rachel. He doesn't know that there's going to be 7 more years, but there is. So after he's fooled and he wants to work 7 more years so that he can have Rachel, you come to the points where he's gained a lot of possessions. I don't know a good way to say, it's like he has a whole estate. Has a lot of material wealth. The family of Laban, his sons, they start to become concerned about this, and Jacob becomes worried that they might try to take it by force from him. So he prays for direction on this, and God tells him, yes, you can go back now. And we briefly mentioned yesterday that was a good representation of faith. It shows that there's a change in Jacob from when he was back here to when he's here. Now he's more willing to ask God or look to God for guidance on what to do. And God tells him what to do, says, okay, go back now. And in this time, it's pretty important, though we're not talking about it so much in this presentation, but it's a real important history, this time of trouble that Jacob deals with, because we know that that's coming along the prophetic line for us. And in this time of trouble, though you may not have, it's as much a unfolding of the prophetic truth as it would be if God was revealing time to Jacob, because here Jacob is dealing with the way that he usurped the birthright ever since the beginning, and he's looking for some sort of confirmation that, because he got news that Esau was coming, and he's looking for some sort of information or encouragement that he will be able to survive this or be protected. And he gets that assurance so that by here this time, Esau finds him, he's pale, crippled, but he has peace. And here we're marking, if you want to read it throughout here, Genesis 33, 1 through 16, or even more in the chapter. This is where I'm marking the fulfillments that Jacob actually does have the spiritual birthright. He received it here. His name was changed. He prevailed, and his name was changed to Israel. So now Jacob becomes the one who carries on the birthright instead of Esau. And in examining this here, what we want to see, if we move on to Joseph, in regards to Joseph, I think we got up to this point yesterday. One thing I think I did not mention is when we start this prophetic line here, this prophetic message that was given, here we're starting in reference to Genesis 15. When the promise was made to Abraham that his posterity was going to not immediately take the promised land. It was going to go into bondage. So now, this is one of the things that I'm also trying to emphasize. There's truth that is being revealed that's immediately relevant to the lifetime of these people, such as Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob. But then there's also truth that was revealed that isn't going to happen so immediately, such as this promise that was made in Genesis 15. So then we wonder, how is this going to be carried out? How is this going to happen? So in examining this line, we find that we're discovering more information in regards to how the bondage of Abraham's posterity is going to happen. Besides that, we have this prophecy that's going on here that was given to Joseph, that he was going to rule over his brothers. So this prophetic information is in the background. It's in the works throughout this line. And the challenging prophetic information that's most relevant for the lifetime of Joseph and his brothers here, and Jacob even, is that he's going to rule over his brothers. And once again, when we start this line, what you find is that there's examples of a poor spiritual condition that God's people are found in. You have Dinah here, who is a nice symbolic representation of a church who's gone to mix with the world, with the ways of the world. You also have idolatry. So pretty much the same sort of backsliding that's going on there. But we find that when it comes to Joseph, he's spiritually minded. We also found that even though he was spiritually minded, there were some character traits that he needed to have fixed, right? And him being sold by this act of rebellion here, by the brothers, actually was a sort of furnace of affliction that God was bringing about or that God was going to use for Joseph's sake. This is another point that I find is repetitive and important to emphasize. It's that when God gives the prophetic message to his people, they aren't ready for it to be fulfilled. There's a work that has to be done so that their faith will increase. And we'll talk more about that in discussing this line down here, Exodus. So when we come to this point where Joseph now, he's in prison. He went to prison because another test came his way, and it was Potiphar's wife. And yesterday we mentioned that this test was very severe. It was a lose-lose situation. But it was only lose-lose in the sense that if he made the choice to stay true to God, he couldn't foresee any immediate reward for that. And there wasn't going to be one. So that's pretty much how the story is going to be played out for us today, I think. That if we stay true to the prophetic message that God is revealing to us, and we want to be the heralds of that message, then there's going to be a furnace of affliction that awaits, because we, like Joseph, will have to have our faith strengthened. Like Joseph, we weren't ready to just have prophecy fulfilled back in 1989. And we do have what we have to look forward to is the second coming of Jesus, right? And the 1,000 years and when he recreates the earth. So these are the things that we know are ahead, and we should understand that while we're doing the work on earth, that it's going to be probably severely challenging. But we can have faith. You have to remember that it's all part of God's plan. When he's revealing this prophecy and is challenging us, challenging our faith, that it's actually meant for our better. It's meant to help us grow. So when Joseph is in prison, and notice that there's this theme here in regards to Joseph. There's two dreams that he has. And then when he's in prison, he also has to deal with two dreams. So since this time, God was revealing a little bit more of the prophecy in how this here is going to be fulfilled. And again, you find, okay, we have some prophetic information now. Joseph is going to be ruling over his family. But we don't know how exactly it's going to happen. And it doesn't look like that's going to happen based on what his brothers did and based on the fact that he's in prison. But while he's in prison, he gets yet even more prophetic revelation because he's able to understand the message regarding time in reference to the butler and the baker. And the time here is 3 days. In your notes, I think it's marked 3 years. And I can't think of a reason why I would have said years based on the subject material here, so it's probably an error. So you should probably change that to days. So 3 days, you have this prophecy, and it comes true. If you look in the spirit of prophecy, you'll find that Joseph is actually in prison for 2 years. So this is time that's involved in the progression of prophetic revelation, but Joseph did not know how long he was going to be in prison. In that regard, you have the butler who Joseph said, hey, maybe put in a good word for me. I'm here in prison, don't want to be here. And the butler forgets this. So it's a bit of a disappointment there for Joseph. Let me check if there's anything I want to read about that. No. So we'll continue now here considering this revelation of time. This is in Genesis 41, and this is the Pharaoh's 2 dreams. Okay. Now, I also mentioned yesterday that the main character of this line here, where we really get a look at what's going on with Joseph. We get to see how his character is being developed. We get to see how at this point here, even at this point, he wasn't ready for the fulfillment of this prophecy, that work needed to be done on him. We see that his brothers take a course of action that is more characteristic of Cain's attitude to the prophetic message. And I think that it works out good for the brothers too. If you consider, have you ever done something that was so selfish? And I say it was so selfish because you didn't even consider, it didn't pass your thoughts how other people would be affected by that thing that you did. If you take a look, if you have, then you can relate to his brothers. Because what they did here was completely selfish. They weren't really thinking about Jacob. And when they had to come up with some way to show Jacob, hey, Joseph, he's not coming back with us, they didn't really care about him then either. They were just looking for an escape from taking the blame. But what they did here did really affect Jacob. If you've read about it, you see that Jacob was sad for a long time after that. And that, I think they didn't expect that it would have affected their father in that way. And so they had to live with that guilt for kind of just as long as Jacob had to live with his guilt of how he usurped the birthright. So throughout all that history, while Jacob's in prison and all that, they're dealing with a father who's sad and depressed about losing a son from his favored wife. So it's a complicated, emotional thing for the family. And throughout that history, we find that something must have been going on with these brethren, because when we're reading about it in Patriarchs and Prophets or the Spirit of Prophecy, you know that when Joseph is testing them around this time, when they come asking for food, and they don't know who Joseph is, and he's challenging them, that Joseph sees they've changed. And he could see that they are repentant of the thing that they did, right? So this is a very interesting situation then, because what happens here and onward, based on how this prophecy that God gave way over here is going to come to fulfillment pretty soon around here, it includes with it a solution for that sin that the brethren committed, because it gives them the means to come clean about that. They eventually, after this time, they tell Jacob what happens. So it's as if God made it easier for them to overcome this, right? And I think that's an interesting connection, because the connection I see has to deal with how the prophetic message that God is giving and that he's progressively revealing, I don't think you can separate the effect that it's having on the people. The way that he's progressively revealing it is actually helping the people to grow, to be more like how we should be if there was never any sin, okay? So it fixes the sin problem. It helps people to overcome the sin problem, as long as they're faithful to that message. Okay, so we know that the Pharaoh, he has two dreams, and Joseph's able to interpret them. And this here, you see more progress in the prophetic revelation, because instead of here, where something had already happened, and we find that there's only 3 days remaining in the case of Butler and Baker, here we find that Joseph is able to foresee it. Or I should restate that. In line with Matthew 24, when we see that it's, or if you even compare that verse to Revelation, we find that God reveals truth to his Son. Then his Son reveals it to angels, and then angels reveal it to man. Then man reveals it to all the other men. In this case, what we find is God is revealing truth, and he chose to do it through Joseph, not the other brothers. It was Joseph specifically. So Joseph, yes, he's not revealing the truth. He's just a voice for the way that it happens. We understand this is that God works through the human elements. He wants the humans to participate in the work of salvation. So Joseph is just reiterating something that God gave him. And it's before the thing is going to happen, this famine of 7 years. But before that, there's 7 years of plenty. So thanks to this revelation by God, Egypt is able to go through this famine unaffected. I think Egypt gains a lot of power in that time because of that famine, because it affected other kingdoms and nations, whereas Egypt was prepared for it. So for 7 years, they're able to gather all their food, and then for the 7 years of the famine, they're good to go, and they can even feed other people from other nations. And they gained much wealth from that because of the suggestions that Joseph gave. And once again, we find that Joseph is here, and he's giving meat in due season, and then he is given authority over the master's goods, right? And then when we come to this point, this is the fulfillment here. I would like to, no, we won't read this, but you have it in your notes. You can read it if you want. This is where Joseph is ruling over his family. It's the fulfillment. And I would like to emphasize the point that he tells his brothers there's yet 5 years of the famine. So time is still a factor here. Joseph is still aware of prophetic events that are yet to unfold. And he's giving that message to his brothers. And then his brothers come to Egypt to dwell in Goshen, to be safe from that remaining 5 years. And that was a plan that was set in place because otherwise they would have had to sell themselves to Egypt, just like others had to do. But instead, they were given freedom to just dwell in Goshen. And then there's another factor here that I'm not certain if it's concrete, but I think it's something worth considering. The thought might have escaped me. It has to do with the Pharaoh. Ah, yes. In the sense of speaking like a dragon. We have a Pharaoh here who favors Joseph. And it seems like that might lend to, if we're taking Egypt to represent the United States, it may lend to the thought that it was a period of time when the United States spoke like a lamb. But we know that after Joseph dies and a new Pharaoh comes in, that Abraham's posterity isn't so well favored. So the approach that Pharaoh has to them is more like a way to inhibit their growth, their prosperity, puts them under bondage. So maybe it looks like that Pharaoh is speaking like a dragon. Maybe there's some sort of a transition there. But I'm not sure how we would apply that on the prophetic line. And here, what we want to look at, Genesis 46, 2 through 4, is in reference to Genesis 15 also. Because as we traveled through this history, and we come to this point, we still don't see the fulfillment of the bondage. But we do see that we're getting closer to that because now all the family has come to Egypt. So Genesis 46, verses 2 through 4, it says, "And God spake unto Israel in the visions of the night, and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here am I. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again, and Joseph shall put his hands upon thine eyes." So here we have more prophetic revelation. God is saying, this is the plan, go into Egypt. I will be with you there, and I will bring you back out of it. Just like he told Abraham when he said they'll go into Egypt and be in bondage, but in the 4th generation, they'll come back out. And it's from this point here that we start to pick up here where it says in Egypt. So we'll start with Exodus. Well, since we're already in Genesis 46, I'll read that one. And so here's just a confirmation of all who went into Egypt. It says, "And the sons of Joseph, which were born him in Egypt, were 2 souls. All the souls of the house of Jacob, which came into Egypt, were 70. And it's from that point that we'll next start considering this last history that we want to examine and looking at how God progressively reveals prophetic information, the characteristics of that, how it challenges God's people, and how it develops them. So if you're not there already, turn to Exodus chapter 1. And then we'll read from verses 8 through 14. Here what we're going to do is get an idea of the bondage that the Israelites are in. So it reads, "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies, and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore did they set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the fields. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor." And remember, this is also in the context of the strategy to try to reduce them, to weaken their nation by killing the male children. So the idea behind this study hopefully was to be so repetitive just by using the book of Genesis. I think that if we find this, when I gave a summary where you have a message that arrives, it tests God's people, it gets prophetically, or it gets progressively revealed how God is going to make that happen. I hope that in covering these subjects here, that you see this is just from the book of Genesis. And if we see it so frequently just in Genesis, then That's more than two witnesses just by looking at different characters, that this might be some kind of repetitive pattern. This may very well be just the way that God reveals prophecy to us and the way that it affects us, so that you can trust it, so that when you're reading the Bible, you know what to look for in any story that you're reading, whoever might be involved in it. I would like it to be so repetitive that hopefully you've got the idea down, that when we're discussing this line, maybe we don't really even need to discuss it because it's been so repetitive so far. Because just like here, we're about to start discussing the bondage that they're in, the state of backsliding, and things like that. And you know what to expect probably, what God's going to do when he finds his people in idolatry, rebellion, bondage. All right? So that's what we're representing here. You have Levi, Kohath, Amram. We're tracking the generations, because God said when this happens, when I bring them out of Egypt, during this history, it's pretty much coming to the end of the fulfillment of their time that they're going to be in bondage. And we were promised that in the fourth generation, he would bring them out. So Levi was the first to go in, and this is just the line of Moses and Aaron specifically. Then Kohath and Amram, and then we'll start talking about Aaron and Moses. But they're marked here in red because we find that they've been affected by this bondage, all the Israelites, in such a way that God wants to bring them out, but he can't just bring them out immediately. And so then you probably have an idea, since he can't bring them out easily, he's going to progressively reveal that prophetic light, how he's going to bring them out. And the reason he's going to do that is so that it carries them through an experience that helps them to leave behind Egypt, to place more faith in God, to trust what he's saying so that they would want to leave. And there's a lot that happens in this history. We mark it in red to emphasize the fact that it's rebellion, it's idolatry, it's apostate's backsliding condition. It appears that the Israelites weren't even keeping the Sabbath, which is something that they had been doing. At least their forefathers were doing that. Moses is born around this time. This is where we mark Exodus 2, verses 1 through 2. But also during this time, Moses, he grows up to 40 years, I think, when he, just like Joseph, just like Jacob, just like Abraham, knows the prophetic information, but doesn't see how it's going to come to pass. So he uses his own strength to try to start making the prophecy happen. So I would like to mention an interesting comparison here. In this story, I think we find something in this Exodus history that connects us to the prophecy that was given to Abraham, that his posterity would go into bondage, they'd be sojourning 400 years. And also something that connects us way back to the flood. So we'll read it here. It says, this is under the subheading, a comparison to the ark. It says, when this cruel decree was in full force, Moses was born. His mother hid him as long as she could with any safety. So she didn't, I don't know what all the other Israelites were doing, but this mother of Moses was holding on to faith. She just felt that, or maybe felt is the wrong word, but she had faith that her son was special somehow, that God was going to work through her son. And so she hides the son. And it says, his mother hid him as long as she could with any safety, and then prepared a little vessel of bulrushes, making it secure with pitch, that no water might enter the little ark. I thought it was interesting that the words chosen there was an ark. So I think it just connects you back to the flood, that story, just to show you that the way God working here is the same way he did before. And it says, and it placed it at the edge of the water, while his sister should be lingering around the water with apparent indifference. She was anxiously watching to see what would become of her little brother. Angels were also watching that no harm should come to the helpless infant, which had been placed there by an affectionate mother and committed to the care of God by her earnest prayers mingled with tears. And these angels directed the footsteps of Pharaoh's daughter to the river, near the very spots where lay the innocent little stranger. The sister of Moses immediately came forward and inquired, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And I'm pretty sure that the Pharaoh's daughter knew what was going on. And also, I just want to take us back to the flood again. Think about the flood in a different way. Why did God want to put whoever accepted that prophetic message into the ark to save them? We don't really have much time to critically think this out, but we know that the reason for the flood is that the sons of God mixed with the daughters of men, and it led to this conclusion that the thoughts and intentions of the hearts of man was only evil continuously. What God was trying to do was preserve the truth on earth. He was trying to preserve the plan of salvation, because it had gotten to the point so badly that humans prior to the flood didn't care even to be saved. So he preserves only 8 people in an ark, and we can find that this is the same theme that's going on with Moses. We have the mother of Moses who has faith that Moses is going to be the means by which her people are saved. And God preserves this with this acted parable here, where she puts them in a basket, a little ark, and it is preserved in the same way that God preserved his people, his truth, throughout the flood. And then we'll continue here in the subheading, "The time of deliverance draws near." It says, we're moving on now to consider Moses. He is growing up. How would this person whom God is going to work through be affected in his time with Egypt? Because he was raised up as an Egyptian. And it says, "Angels instructed Moses that God had chosen him to deliver the children of Israel. The rulers among the children of Israel were also taught by angels that the time for their deliverance was nigh, and that Moses was the man whom God would use to accomplish this work." So here we have Moses. He comes to an understanding that God is going to work through him to accomplish this work that God wants to do. And also we find that the elders, the leaders of Israel, aside from Moses, they've been made aware that Moses is the one who's going to bring them out of Egypt. Moses thought that the children of Israel would be delivered by warfare. So here we have, even though they understand what God told them, they don't really understand it completely. They're required to believe it. It's testing their faith. And here we have Moses manifesting a lack of faith. And here we also have the reason why Moses has to go through a furnace of affliction. So he thought they'd be delivered by warfare, and that he would stand at the head of the Hebrew host to conduct the warfare against the Egyptian armies and deliver his brethren from the yoke of oppression. This is a recurring thing. The prophetic message that God gives is always, when he reveals how it's going to happen, it doesn't look like it would be successful from the human perspective. Continuing on, it says, "Moses was too fast in slaying the Egyptian. He supposed that the people of Israel understood that God's special providence had raised him up to deliver them." I think you could apply this setting, this context, to our prophetic line right now since 1989. What you might come to an understanding of when the 2520 or the significance of 9/11, or the fact that the time that Seventh-day Adventism has before its close of probation is sooner than it had originally believed, and you believe it and you trust it, and you go out to share that, I think you'll find the people are in the same condition as Moses found this other person who he killed an Egyptian to save. That same person is the one who went and spread rumors that magnified to make it so that Moses, he had to flee Egypt. All right. So it wasn't just he killed a man. They said, yeah, he killed a man, and also he wants to take Pharaoh's position. The rumors started spreading. So I think we find the same situation today. The people who are in Egyptian bondage aren't so ready to leave it. Okay, so he thought they understood that God's special providence had raised him up to deliver them, but God did not design to deliver the children of Israel by warfare, as Moses thought, but by his own mighty power, that the glory might be ascribed to him alone. So Moses, he goes into exile, he runs away, and then for 40 more years, he's going through a process of unlearning things and learning other things. He becomes a shepherd, he gets married, and if we look at Exodus chapter 4, verse 19, it says, "And the Lord said unto Moses in Midian, Go, return into Egypt, for all the men are dead which sought thy life." So it's once again, it's unbeknownst to Moses, but this 40 years that he spends there is the time that God chose for him to be prepared to actually do the work that God wanted to do in accordance with the way God wanted to do it. And God finally reveals to him, it's time to go back now. And then there might be something we want to look at in Exodus 3. Let me check real fast. Yeah, if you read those verses, you find that it's God saying that he's about to bring the deliverance about. But we're not going to read that. What we do want to read, though, here is from these quotations that we've taken from Spirit of Prophecy. We'll start with the first one underneath Exodus 3:16 through 22. It says, "The time had fully come when God would have Moses exchange the shepherd's staff for the rod of God, which he would make powerful in accomplishing signs and wonders, in delivering his people from oppression, and in preserving them when pursued by their enemies." And here's the point I've been trying to emphasize in talking about this bondage that they're in. It says, Moses did not expect that this was the manner in which the Lord would use him to deliver Israel from Egypt. So when God at the burning bush is revealing his will to Moses, well, we'll read about it, but this is that context. It says, "He thought that it would be by warfare, and when the Lord made known to him that he must stand before Pharaoh and in his name demand him to let Israel go, he shrank from the task." And I think if we put ourselves in Moses' shoes, we also would think you would rather carry out warfare than do it the way that God is telling you to do it here. It's pretty intimidating what God is asking Moses to do. So you have to take what God is saying and just trust him, because walking into the Pharaoh to demand for people to leave is, you might die doing something like that, all right? Who knows what the law of Egypt was at that time? I don't, but it just didn't seem like a good idea. And once again, this is another point I've been trying to emphasize this way that God is working, it goes against our way that we think it should work, and it tests our faith that way. So continuing on, it says, he entreated the Lord to select a more proper person. The backwardness of Moses at first proceeded from humility, a modest diffidence. But after God promised to remove his difficulties and be with his mouth, and teach him what to say and give him success finally in his mission, then for him to still manifest reluctance was displeasing to God. So here you have Moses once again manifesting a lack of faith. So Moses is given some more prophetic information by God and how it's going to be carried out, the plan of the Exodus. And God encourages him that he will be with him, and he even says it will succeed. And Moses still is reluctant. So continuing, it says, his unwillingness to execute the mission God had preserved his life to fill and had qualified him to perform after the assurance that God would be with him showed unbelief and criminal despondency and distrust of God himself. The Lord rebuked him for this distrust. The deliverance of Israel out of Egypt, in the manner God proposed to do the work, looked hopeless to him of the missions ever being successful. And then continuing, it says, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well, and also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee. So here's more prophetic revelation. He knows Aaron is coming, Moses doesn't, but he revealed that to Moses. He cometh forth to meet thee, and when he seeth thee, he will be glad in his heart. And thou shalt speak unto him, and put words in his mouth, and I will be with thy mouth, and with his mouth, and will teach you what ye shall do. And ye shall be thy spokesman unto the people, and he shall be, even he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be to him instead of God. And thou shalt take this rod in thine hand, wherewith thou shalt do signs. So here's another thing that's important. This line here is a little bit more, it has more details in it than the others we've considered, possibly maybe more than Abraham's too. This one seems to have a lot of similarities to our current history because it wasn't just a prophetic message that Moses and Aaron had to announce to the Israelites. They also were to give signs. And I think you can see that in our history we've had both the prophetic message and signs that it's coming to fulfillment. So God was really making things most favorable for the Israelites to succeed in this. And then what I also find is interesting, when we come to this, around this time here, this is where we're at, prior to where the 10 plagues start to fall. The first opportunity that the Pharaoh has to release the children of Israel is the message that Moses had for the Pharaoh is actually the message of this Passover here. So before you get to the 10 plagues, God already says, Israel is my firstborn, let him go. If you don't let him go, I'll take your firstborn. And Pharaoh refuses. So once again, you have this prophetic revelation here where it says that there's something about the firstborn that's going to happen, but we have yet to discover how or when it's going to happen. And we find throughout the plagues, considering it from this perspective, from this look at it, the plagues are like a prophetic progression that brings us closer to the fulfillment of that first promise that God made to the Pharaoh to begin with. So that Passover was revealed from the start, and you could find that in Exodus 4, 21 through 23. And then you have circumcision, because as they're going to Egypt, we just want to mention this for a moment. The way it reads it here, it says, as Moses journeyed to Egypt, the angel of the Lord met him and assumed a threatening posture as though he would slay him. He was fearful of his life. He had yielded to the refusal of his wife to have their son circumcised, and in compliance with her wishes had neglected to obey God. So the circumcision, if you think about that, Moses wasn't being endangered by God for any keeping of the Ten Commandments, but he was in danger for negligence to a command of God, which was the circumcision. Today, circumcision, literal circumcision, is irrelevant to us. So instead, think about the symbol. What is the prophetic relevance for circumcision? And this is easy. It's a covenant relationship with God. So you have to have this to carry out this work. Otherwise, you won't be able to carry out this work of giving a message to people, of participating in the work of salvation that God has. And if you think of what replaced circumcision, that would be baptism. And then if you compare the history of when John the Baptist and Jesus were on earth to ours, we find that all of the Jews already had, supposedly, this covenant relationship with God because they were circumcised. But baptism was required for them. And if you compare that history to ours, I think that it may help you to consider, well, the Seventh-day Adventist Church is full of people who are already in a covenant relationship with God. They've been baptized. But if you follow the prophetic history, you find that entering into that covenant relationship with God is still a requirement in our time. So it's just like you could say the Jews, they were already baptized, but they still had to be baptized. Jesus even told this to Nicodemus, if you remember that. And then you have the announcement of the Exodus there, Exodus 4, 29 through 30. Yeah, we have some time left here to highlight the Laodicean condition. So we'll start talking about the condition of the people now. How did they react, the Jews, the Israelites, to what was beginning to take place here when God was ready to deliver them? It says, the Hebrews expected to be delivered from their bondage without any particular trial of their faith. In that, they were disappointed. So they expected that it wouldn't require any particular trial of their faith or suffering on their part. They were, many of them, ready to leave Egypt, but not all. The habits of some had become so much like the Egyptians that they preferred to remain with them. They were not prepared to be delivered. They had but little faith and were unwilling to patiently suffer and perseveringly endure their afflictions until God should work for them a glorious deliverance. So part of this progressive prophetic revelation involves this affliction that's going to come to God's people. When initially Moses and Aaron announced that we're going to leave Egypt now and start keeping the Sabbath, they did. They start keeping the Sabbath, and they're immediately for doing that, they entered upon affliction, right? But the purpose of this was to get their mindsets. It was to take them out of the world. It was to make them not Egyptian. It was to help build their faith because their faith was small. It says, many years had the children of Israel been in servitude to the Egyptians. Only a few families went down into Egypt. But they had become a large multitude, and being surrounded with idolatry, many of them had lost the knowledge of the true God and had forgotten his law. And they united with the Egyptians in their worship of the sun, moon, and stars, also of beasts and images, the work of men's hands. Everything around the children of Israel was calculated to make them forget the living God. Yet there were those among the Hebrews who preserved the knowledge of the true God, the maker of the heavens and the earth. So even in that backslidden, apostate condition, there was a remnant, right? And the other one here says, but many of the Hebrews were content to remain in bondage rather than to go to a new country and meet with the difficulties attending such a journey. Therefore, the Lord did not deliver them by the first display of his signs and wonders before Pharaoh. He overruled events to more fully develop the tyrannical spirit of Pharaoh, and that he might manifest his great power to the Egyptians and also before his people, to make them anxious to leave Egypt and choose the service of God. So what God is doing is calculated to make his people want to leave. So they're found to be in this apostate condition. And I don't think I need to, I hope that at this point in considering these histories, you can see how this condition here is relevant to us, to the Seventh-day Adventists. And the reason why the way that our prophetic line has happened, you could find the reason why it's happened that way. 1989, 1996, 2001, onward. We find that these waymarks that we look at, these things that we look at and we see this is the way God has worked, this is the way he's revealed prophetic information to us. These are like, I'm not saying this like you should interpret it this way, but I'm saying that you can compare it to the plagues. Because when he was giving signs, he didn't just use the first initial signs and then deliver God's people. He took them through an experience, plague after plague after plague, which was gradually making them willing to leave. So it was building up their faith, it was encouraging them. And in regard to the plagues, we'll finish up on this note. Here you have listed the plagues. We won't be able to cover each of these plagues by reading through them in the time that we have remaining. But if you have time sometime, I don't think it would take too long for you to look at these. It's interesting to see that you find progress in these plagues. And if you're looking at it from the perspective of, okay, is God actually going to say when things are going to happen? You do find it. You have with the, let's see, how many plagues do we have here? Well, it's listed out there for you. There, you see that there's some time involved. In these references, starting with Exodus 7, 15 through 25, you have the promise that it's in the morning that you're supposed to do this. I think it's the blood. The water became blood. And this lasted 7 days. So there's time involved with these plagues. But the time isn't being revealed. That's gradually. If you continue looking on, I think Exodus 8, verses 9 through 10 are really nice because we'll just read those, and then we'll close. So the frogs just happened, and Pharaoh asks, take away the frogs, please. And the response here, let's see, 9 and 10 is, and Moses said unto Pharaoh, glory over me, when shall I entreat for thee, and for thy servants, and for thy people, to destroy the frogs from thee and thy houses, that they may remain in the river only? And Pharaoh made a choice. He says, tomorrow. And then Moses says, be it according to thy word, that thou mayest know that there is none like unto the Lord, our God. So think about that. This plague of frogs happened. Pharaoh wants it gone. And Moses took the opportunity to show our God so that you may know who he is. You choose a time when you want him to take away the frogs. And Pharaoh chooses one, and God makes it happen. So it's like a confirmation that God is doing this. He's able to do this, and he's able to do it in a timely manner. It wasn't just chance, right? But you can continue through there and you see that progressively throughout these plagues, God is telling when a plague is going to happen, approximately when it's going to happen, until you get to the point of the Passover, when he announces this one's going to happen on a day and an hour, right? You have midnight, and you have the day. And so Passover happens, and then you come to the fulfillment of Exodus, which you can find in Exodus 12, or they're released now, they're able to go, they're able to leave Egypt. This is fulfilling Genesis 15, when it says they'll be in bondage for 400 years, but in the fourth generation they'll be taken out. And you can read about that in Exodus chapter 12, verses 40 through 41. So I hope that this was so repetitive to you that you our confidence in what's going on in our movement today. That you can be assured. I hope that this was just from mostly the book of Genesis. And I think that it's enough reason for us to look at what happened with Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. I think we can look at those things and understand that we can trust God. And however things are going to play out in our time now, that's what we're studying. And we can count on the fact that God is going to reveal it in accordance with his will. And we can count on that it's going to test us. And so we'll close with prayer now. Gracious Father, we would like to come before you, and we would like to ask that you just please continue to be with us throughout this day. And we also ask that you please bless the remaining speakers and the things that they want to present. We ask that these are opportunities for us to grow in faith, for us to understand the work that you're doing in this time more thoroughly. We would like to ask that you take this camp meeting, these days and these hours, as an opportunity altogether to encourage us and strengthen us the way that we see you did for Jacob when you reassured him, for Joseph. And we just ask that you continue to do that work among us in accordance with your will. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.